I am the youngest of 4 siblings, and my older siblings introduced me to poetry at a very young age. And one of their favorite poems was by Shel Silverstein, and it was called For Sale. It goes like this: one sister for sale, one sister for sale, one crying and spying young sister for sale. I'm really not kidding, so who'll start the bidding? Do I hear $1, a nickel, a penny? Oh, isn't there any one kid who will buy this old sister for sale, this crying and spying young sister for sale? I have no idea why they liked that poem. I was a really delightful youngest child, and I know that I was never annoying in any way. But it makes you wonder, was Shel Silverstein writing from personal experience, or was he borrowing the story that we have from the Bible about Joseph and his older brothers? Today we're going to look at that story of Joseph and his brothers from Genesis. And this is a story of loss, grief, treachery, betrayal, common family dynamics. Actually, sadly, it is actually pretty common for families to have that dynamic. I am constantly struck in my conversations with people and just lived experience how deeply family members can hurt one another, and how some of those wounds last years or decades, or even are carried for generations. Some of the biggest struggles in people's lives are the relationships that they have with people who are closest to them. Our sermon series throughout Lent is called The Struggle is Real. Now, I'm wondering if any of you have ever heard this phrase, the struggle is real. Maybe, how many of you have said this phrase? The struggle is real. This is true. The struggle is real. And there are so many kinds of struggles. People use it to describe just their daily annoyances of things that get in the way of what they want to accomplish for that day. Or they can say it with a heavy heart of grief when they're just struggling to get through any day. The struggle is real. Lent is a good time to deal with the hard stuff. As Deacon Julie said, those things from the movie We Don't Talk About Bruno. In this case, we can say Bruno is those hard things that we don't want to talk about. But Lent is a good time to do that. We started Lent with Ash Wednesday, and those who came received a cross of ashes on their forehead. We are a marked people as we walk through this season of Lent. Now, that can be a hopeful symbol. When we see the cross, we remember what Jesus has done for us on the cross. We remember how through the cross we are claimed as God's children, so we can wear that hopeful reminder. But that cross of ashes also reminds us of our sin, of our brokenness, of death. These are things that we all struggle with, but that we really want to avoid. During Lent, let's not avoid the hard things. Let's deal with them. Let's talk about the tsunami of grief and loss and mental health struggles that people are dealing with right now. Let's talk about loss, not to wallow in it, but to face it, to engage it, to struggle with it, and even to grow from it. Let's see where God is in the midst of the hard things, in the midst of the struggles and the losses, and let's see how God is leading us through. There are so many kinds of loss that people deal with. Some is really obvious, but some losses are not obvious to the rest of the world and are hard to make sense of, even yourself. There is loss of relationship. That can happen when someone dies, or when you go through a divorce, or when you are betrayed by someone, or you have a falling out and you lose a relationship. There's the loss of familiarity and routine. I think of how everybody's routines were disrupted throughout this time of pandemic. But also your routine or familiarity can be disrupted if you move to a new town or city or house. There's also the loss of health, maybe a cancer diagnosis or another life-altering condition that changes how you move through the world. There's the loss of property or a precious possession. I think of families who've lost their homes due to house fires, or if something valuable was stolen from you. There's the loss of power, when for whatever reason you are not allowed to make decisions for yourself. Maybe you are in a time where you should not be driving anymore. Loss of power is hard. But then, coming out of the last few years, there's a few specific things related to the pandemic. Loss of dreams or of opportunities of how you thought life would go, and then all of a sudden it threw a curveball and life is going in a different direction. There was the loss of rites of passage. I think of the graduation parties that didn't happen, or the college experience that people were looking forward to that was completely different. I think of the loss of trust in people that has happened in the last few years. So over these 6 weeks of Lent, we are going to look at 6 Bible stories that deal with loss, that deal with hard things. And we're going to look at different ways of moving through loss. So for this first week, we are going to look at one way to move through loss, and that is by finding meaning in the loss. What kind of story will you tell about your loss? You can tell a story that helps you cope, that helps you see the presence of God, that helps build some resilience, or you can tell a story that leaves you stuck. There are different ways to tell the story and to find meaning in the things that we have gone through. So now let's look at this story of Joseph and his brothers. The part of the story that I shared with you before the sermon was that last moment of Genesis where Joseph's brothers are scared that they won't be forgiven, and yet Joseph offers them forgiveness. So now let's back up, and I'll just try to recap some of the stuff that happened earlier. So there were 12 brothers in Joseph's family. These were the sons of Jacob, and Jacob is our ancestor of faith who also received the name Israel after he wrestled with the angel of God. But Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph was the second to youngest, and the 2 youngest were Joseph's favorite children, and were Jacob's favorite children. And Joseph received this coat of beautiful colors from his dad. He was the one who was precocious, and he was annoying to his older siblings. I don't know why they would think that, but he would follow them around and tell them about dreams he had. And his dreams were usually about them someday bowing down before him. I don't know why that would be annoying. And so I wonder if precursor to Shel Silverstein, that's when they were like, how can we get rid of him? So they actually debated a few different options. They were like, let's just kill him. And then they were like, wait, if we kill him, we can't make any money doing that. Let's sell him to somebody, traders who are traveling through town. Let's sell him and at least make some money, and we'll just tell our dad that he got killed by a wild animal. So that's what the brothers did. And Joseph ends up moving or being sold and being bought by someone in Egypt, and he becomes a servant in a household, and things are going okay. But then he gets falsely accused by this person's wife, and his master Potiphar throws him into prison, and he's stuck in prison, and he didn't do anything wrong. And then he starts interpreting other people's dreams in prison. And the people who are serving time with him really appreciate it, and they say, we're going to remember you when we get out. And they get out, and they don't remember him. And then it's finally years later when the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, is having dreams that he can't understand. And one of the ex-cons who works for him is like, oh yeah, there was a guy back in prison, really good at interpreting dreams. So they finally pull Joseph out of prison, and he's able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And he says, your dream means that there will be 7 years of bumper crops and plentiful harvest, followed by 7 years of famine. And so you should find someone who can help save some of the bumper years each year so that when there is a famine, food can be distributed to people. And Pharaoh said, "That's a great idea. You be in charge of that job." So finally, Joseph comes into some power. And his brothers, who do not live in Egypt, travel to Egypt to get help from him. But they don't know it's Joseph that they're talking to and requesting food from. But Joseph recognizes them. And there's all sorts of back and forth that you should read about if you read through this account in Genesis. But then we get to this moment where Joseph reveals who he is to his brothers, and they all weep together. And Joseph has all of his brothers and his father move to Egypt so they can be together. And then, after their father finally dies in his old age, the brothers get scared again. And that's the moment that I shared with you. And the brothers are worried about saving themselves again. And they're like, let's just tell Joseph that our dad said to forgive us, because we know Joseph respected our dad. And now that our dad isn't here, if we just say, Dad really did want you to forgive us, they tell him this. And Joseph knows they're scheming. And yet Joseph had made a choice to forgive them. They didn't deserve it. Joseph had lost a lot. He lost time. Those years he could have had back home with his family. He lost his home, his culture, his freedom. And all those years that he spent in Egypt and those years he was in prison, he could have dwelled on that one pivotal experience, that moment where his brothers sold him that changed the trajectory of his life. And he could have just dwelled on it and been bitter about it. And yet somewhere in those years, he made a choice to focus on where God showed up rather than on how people had failed him. And he could have focused on the failures. He had every right to do that. But he chose to say, yes, this happened. Yes, it was hard. Yes, I can't erase the hard things that have happened. And yes, people will fail me, and people won't be able to love me the way I want to be loved, and people will mess up. And yet I'm choosing to focus on how God never abandoned me. And because of the presence of God, he chooses to highlight the ways God works. And the story he tells is then a story that is full of grace and forgiveness. And any time that kind of grace or forgiveness is offered to someone, it's a miracle. Because we all know how hard it is to forgive someone who has done something hard and terrible to us. But Joseph chose to focus on God. Joseph chose not to just see the terrible things, but to acknowledge those terrible things and move forward. That's the kind of story he told. So I'm wondering what kind of losses you are carrying with you today. Things that can't be erased. Maybe things that happened beyond your control, that came out of left field, or were done to you by someone you trusted. How will you carry those losses? Those things can't be erased. They can't just be put under the rug. But how can you choose to see God also present, giving you strength in those times when you were deeply hurt and in pain? What kind of story do you want to tell in the future about your life? Will it be a story that has forgiveness offered? Or will it be a story of anger and bitterness? That is where we start our Lenten journey. Amen.